Silas Creed chose the busiest hour at Martha Pike's general store, when wagons stood wheel to wheel in the rutted yard, and nearly half of Dry Creek had reason to linger by the flour sacks, the lamp oil, and the stove that never quite heated the full room. He planted his boots beside the seed counter and asked Russell Harmon to stand where all could see her, a widow in a plain wool coat, one hand resting on the worn walnut stock of the rifle she carried across her saddle each time she rode in from her claim. He spoke as a town trustee, with Deputy Owen Bell at the stove and Reverend Joel Mercer against the wall, and he said a woman alone on a 160-acre claim had no honest intention of perfecting title, only delaying men who could put that ground to proper use before spring drive season. Martha Pike kept her store ledger open while she listened, and she did not interrupt when Silas said the widow had built fear into the town with constant talk of hard weather, as though weather obeyed private worry. Ned Creed, his eldest son, leaned on a nail keg and added that Russell was digging a cellar deep enough to hide from her own shadows, and men laughed in the way groups laughed when the speaker already held power. Russell answered with one sentence, stating that occupancy, improvements, and continued residence met the law whether her critics approved or not, and she asked Deputy Bell to take notice that Silas had cut the wagon track across the north draw, which blocked her shortest haul road to timber. Bell shifted his hat brim and called the crossing a civil disagreement between neighboring claims. Silas let that refusal settle in the room. Then he raised his voice and said, "No bank, no trustee, and no sensible merchant should extend her credit $1 farther for a winter she had invented in her head." Martha Pike closed her ledger and said purchases would be cash for cash, no exceptions. Reverend Mercer watched Russell and asked whether she wished to answer the town's judgment, and she said only that January would answer it for her. She bought 2 pounds of nails, paid in coin, lifted her sack without waiting for help, and stepped into a gray afternoon where wind had begun to come down from the northwest in a steady, narrow stream that carried no moisture and no mercy. 5 years earlier, in June of 1882, Elias Harmon and Russell Harmon had filed their homestead entry for that same 160-acre quarter outside Dry Creek, Dakota Territory, a claim of grass, short cottonwood, and heavy sod that broke plow points if iron ran too shallow. Dry Creek counted 287 souls that summer, enough for a church, a schoolhouse with 2 rooms, 1 general store, a livery, and confidence that rail access at the Bismarck Spur, 46 miles east, put the town within reach of any hardship worth naming. Elias and Russell had come from Minnesota after 2 harvest failures, and one winter that took 3 milk cows and nearly took Elias's younger brother, and they came with habits that looked severe to neighbors who had not yet seen a northern plain close itself in snow. Their first house on the claim had been a modest sod structure. Low roof, narrow windows, and a stove placed near center mass for efficient heat spread through 2 small rooms rather than 1 large room that bled warmth into rafters. Elias had kept field ledgers with survey bearings, seed counts, receipts, weather marks, and dates of each improvement, written in a compact hand that did not waste ink. He recorded board feet bought, fence lines set, and hours spent hauling water from the draw in dry months. Russell worked beside him in all of it, and neighbors saw her work, though many treated her labor as assistive labor, never principal labor, the sort of distinction that seemed harmless until title and survival both depended on who the town believed could build, decide, and endure without male supervision. On an April road in 1887, a wagon loaded with milled pine for roof repair hit a thaw-softened shoulder above a culvert and rolled, throwing Elias under the rear wheel before a farmhand could reach him. He lived long enough for Reverend Mercer to pray, and long enough to ask Russell to keep every ledger dry and every receipt in order, and he died before sunrise in the back room of Martha Pike's store. where she sometimes housed the injured when weather blocked travel to a doctor. The burial drew nearly all 287 souls, and the condolences were sincere, though sincerity did not alter land hunger, trustee politics, or the value of a 160-acre tract that sat across a useful driveline to Silas Creed's winter range. After Elias died, the legal question narrowed quickly and publicly. Could Russell continue residence and improvements long enough to satisfy final proof under the Homestead Act process? Or would pressure break occupancy and return the ground to contest? Silas Creed began visiting the trustee desk more frequently. He argued in meetings that Dry Creek needed practical claim holders with hired men and stable capital, and he described widow occupancy as temporary sentiment dressed in legal language. Martha Pike adjusted store credit terms in the same season, and the change was rational in business terms, since unsettled title meant uncertain repayment. Though everyone understood whose accounts retained flexibility and whose moved to cash only, Russell sold 2 steers earlier than planned to raise coin, paid for staples, and kept building. The September hearing at the storehouse, where Silas humiliated her in front of witnesses, created a record she had not requested and could not avoid. It also removed one uncertainty that had lingered through summer. Public power in Dry Creek had chosen its side in the open. Once that happened, Russell altered her schedule and treated autumn as a closing gate. She measured exterior walls and decided existing thickness would fail in prolonged killing wind, so she cut fresh sod blocks and doubled the outer courses to a full 24 inches, packing seams with clay and straw, then adding an interior liner where drafts had previously pooled at floor level. She lowered one door lintel to reduce heat loss from convection. She sealed one window entirely and left only south-facing light where winter sun could contribute a little gain. Labor cost money she did not have, so she converted obligation into barter where possible, mending harness and stitching winter coats at night for 2 neighboring families in exchange for 2 weeks of digging help before ground locked hard. With that help, she sank a root cellar to 9 feet. Framed with scavenged plank and braced with cottonwood poles peeled in spring and cured under shed cover. She lined shelves for jar storage, left a central aisle wide enough for carrying sacks in mittens, and set a vent system using 1 low intake and 1 high outlet to reduce moisture rot. She kept the access hatch under a leeward overhang and built a second interior hatch to trap cold when the outer door opened in storm conditions. October brought clear skies, and clear skies on that plain often fooled towns that judged winter by what stood overhead, rather than what moved at distance. So Russell shifted to fuel while roads still held. She stacked 14 cords of firewood by species and use, cottonwood for fast start, ash where she could obtain it for longer burn, and she raised the stacks on pole runners to keep bottom courses from wicking meltwater into freeze rot. Silas's riders blocked the north draw crossing twice that month, claiming trespass across his leased section. Each blockage cost her hours and horse strength, forcing a longer loop by the creek bend. She chose not to contest in court before winter because filing would consume money needed for fuel, and because January would not wait for legal calendars. Food came next, measured as arithmetic rather than comfort. She set 6 barrels of flour under dry cover, each sealed and elevated from dirt floor on plank strips. She cured and stored 420 pounds of salt pork, divided by cut and wrapped in cloth treated against insects before freeze. She packed grain for porridge and mash, sealed beans and dried squash, and counted servings against likely shelter load if town structures failed. Kerosene stood at 38 gallons by late November, enough for lamps and controlled stove starts through extended cloud cover, when wood ignition became difficult with damp hands and exhausted men. Martha Pike sold the kerosene at posted price and took cash to the penny, never extending line, never speaking insult directly. letting policy perform what speech did not need to repeat. Ned Creed turned mockery into performance through that same period. At the livery, he told Teamsters the widow was stockpiling for a private kingdom underground. At church social nights, he asked whether she planned to feed blizzards by the spoon. He rode past her gate with 2 companions and called out that her rifle would not shoot weather out of the sky, and that line traveled through town because it sounded quick and cruel enough to remember. Russell answered none of it in public. She repaired harness, caulked seams, moved sacks, and marked each task complete in Elias's ledger margin beside her own initials, preserving a daily chain of occupancy work that no hearing officer could dismiss as rumor. Deputy Owen Bell saw the harassment escalate and still refused formal intervention, stating each complaint concerned access routes, trespass disputes, or spoken insult, all civil matters unless violence occurred. His caution came from habit and from a frontier understanding that law often arrived late and thin, with deputies expected to keep blood off streets and little else. That refusal resolved one question for Russell while opening another. She could no longer plan around any external protection from town authority. Every remaining winter task had to stand on her own labor, her small trade network, and the discipline she and Elias had built over 5 years. She shifted one final effort towards storm signaling, setting rope lines between house, shed, and cellar hatch, and hanging a bell where gloved hands could find it in blind drift. By early December, weather signs changed in ways old northern farmers recognized at once. Light carried a hard metallic edge before noon. Horses turned hindquarters to wind in open field, even on mild days. Snow buntings moved lower and faster, and geese crossed in compressed lines with no circling delay. Russell checked Elias's aneroid barometer each evening and watched pressure fall in a pattern that suggested a fast deep system building farther north than townspeople assumed likely before midwinter. She rode into Dry Creek on a Saturday, waded through church service, and spoke on the steps when congregants emerged in coats and good hats. She said the pressure drop and bird movement pointed to an early hard blizzard, and she asked each household to store at least 10 days of food and pull rope lines between doorways. Silas Creed answered before Reverend Mercer could respond. He said weather prophecies had become the widow's newest claim strategy. Fear as leverage, where law had not yet granted title. Ned laughed and told boys near the hitch rail that if storms obeyed barometers, every store clerk would command the sky. A few families listened in silence and took notes, though none spoke up against Silas in that crowd. Reverend Mercer thanked Russell for caution and said each household would decide as conscience and means allowed. She left without argument, rode home against a stinging crosswind, and stopped at the stable long enough to rest her forehead against her mare's neck and say that if the wind came early, no one in town had prepared enough to meet it. Christmas week passed with brittle cold and no heavy snow, which strengthened public confidence that Silas had judged correctly. Martha Pike sold holiday sugar and coffee in ordinary volume. Men at the stove in her store spoke of spring calves. Russell remained on claim and finished small tasks that looked excessive to anyone not counting failure modes. Extra ash buckets near each doorway, mittens tied in pairs by sleeping cots, and water barrels shifted indoors to prevent frozen stoppers at the worst hour. She wrapped Elias's ledgers in oilcloth and placed them in a high crate above root cellar level, where flood or drift seepage could not reach them. She cleaned her rifle, set 6 cartridges in a tin, and kept the weapon by the door for wolves, signaling or whatever January demanded first. On January 10th, 1888, a weak sun rose behind a milk-white sheet and never cut through. By afternoon, wind veered north and sharpened fast enough to peel loose straw from roof edges. Russell took final stock before dusk and confirmed all locked quantities remained intact. 6 barrels of flour, 420 pounds of salt pork, 38 gallons of kerosene, and 14 cords of wood under cover. She added water kettles to both stoves and slept in layered clothing with boots near the bed. Dry Creek closed its doors that night with ordinary caution, not emergency discipline, and no household had laid town-wide guide ropes because no town-wide decision had ever been made to accept her warning as policy. The blizzard hit before dawn on January 11th with wind that erased horizon in minutes and drove powder through any seam wider than a nailhead. Russell stepped out on line rope at first light and could not see her sheed from her doorway. By noon, drifts had buried lower fence rails and blocked leeward exits. She measured outdoor temperature from a protected thermometer and recorded minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit at peak cold, a number that stripped argument from every conversation still underway in town. Dry Creek's main street disappeared under moving white. Men who had planned short crossings between store, livery, and home found direction gone by the second doorway. Travel without line became guesswork, with fatal margins measured in yards. The first day forced households inward. The second day broke confidence. Stoves in larger framed houses struggled because heat climbed to ceilings and vanished through imperfect roofs, while floor-level cold thickened and children could not sleep. Kerosene lamps failed in several homes where wicks had not been trimmed and reserves were low. Martha Pike's store, normally the town's thermal center, lost draft control after wind-packed snow into one vent path, and interior temperature dropped enough to freeze spilled molasses hard near the counter. She sent Annie Pike, age 11, with a scarf wrapped twice and a rope tied to her waist, aiming for the nearest stable where men might help reset the vent. Midway through that crossing, the rope snagged and tore free at a wagon tongue hidden under drift. Annie did not reach the stable. She followed fence posts by touch, veered south without knowing it, and found Russell's outer line by accident when her mitten struck the hanging bell at the claim gate. Russell heard the bell through wind and opened the storm porch within seconds, hauling the child inside by coat collar and waistband, then stripping frozen outer layers before ice bonded to wool. Annie could still speak. She said her mother had sent her for help and the store stove had gone weak. That sentence resolved the social stalemate that had held through months of mockery, because a child had crossed first and asked openly for aid where adults had withheld acknowledgement. Russell wrapped Annie in dry blankets, set warm broth by a slow spoon, and loaded her sled immediately. She tied Annie to the sled, took the rifle for signaling, and moved along her own rope lines back toward town edge where visibility fell below 10 feet. At each junction, she fired one shot upward to mark direction for anyone near enough to hear and follow sound. The first group she found included Deputy Bell and 2 men trying to move an elderly couple from a failing house. Bell had lost one glove and the fingers of his right hand were whitening. He saw Annie on the sled and understood in one glance which shelter still held heat, food, and order. He asked whether Russell could take more. She answered with instructions, not grievances. Bring everyone who could walk, double rope at waist height, move in pairs, leave pride where the wind could keep it. As the third day opened, the line to Russell's claim thickened. Martha Pike arrived with 2 store clerks and no hat brim left unbroken by ice. Reverend Mercer came carrying a satchel of bandages and church records he had refused to abandon to moisture. Silas Creed appeared near dusk with 3 ranch hands and frost on his beard to the jawline, asking entry with the posture of a man who had spent months denying he might need the person at the door. He had blocked her wagon access in autumn to tighten pressure before hearing season. Now he stood in her porch with nowhere else to send his men, and he said in front of Bell and Mercer that he had blocked her draw road and had no claim to favor after that. Russell stepped aside and counted heads inward. telling him to tie onto the shelter line and bring his hands through first, then assigning floor space by age and injury, while Annie passed tin cups from the kettle. Ned Creed remained outside that shelter line through the worst of the third night. He had left a rope team earlier, telling companions he could cut across to check a calf shed near his father's south fence and return in minutes. Wind took his bearings within 1 field length. Searchers could not track in moving drift. At first light on January 14th, when gusts eased enough to see shapes at 20 yards, Deputy Bell and Silas found him against a half-buried windbreak, one hand still closed around a snapped rope end and his scarf frozen stiff against his mouth. He was 23 years old. He had laughed loudest in the storehouse hearing. Silas carried his son part of the way to Russell's porch because no wagon could move yet. Inside, survival had become arithmetic, managed by discipline. Russell triaged arrivals at the inner door by frostbite risk, chest sounds, and core warmth, and Bell watched her sequence hold, while his own earlier refusal to intervene returned to him in practical form. Each organized choice she made, preserving lives his autumn inaction had left exposed. She rationed flour by household count and labor load, stretching porridge at dawn and thicker bread at dusk. She cut salt pork portions to preserve protein for children and men returning from line searches. Kerosene use stayed strict, lamps trimmed short after evening care to protect the remaining 38-gallon reserve for essential light and fire starts. Wood burned in sequence, quick cottonwood for ignition, denser pieces banked overnight, and ash removed on schedule to maintain draft and prevent carbon buildup in crowded rooms. The 24-inch sod walls held interior temperature above freezing at floor level, even when wind screamed outside, and the 9-foot cellar remained stable enough for food retrieval in short rotations without collapsing into damp panic. No one paid at the door. No one signed debt slips. Martha Pike watched that policy with the same attention she usually gave credit ledgers, because she understood exactly what leverage looked like and exactly what it meant to set leverage aside when need outran commerce. Deputy Bell treated frostbite under Russell's instructions. Warm water progression, dry wraps, no rubbing of frozen tissue, and he wrote names of arrivals by lamplight so missing persons could be checked once wind dropped. Reverend Mercer moved cot to cot, reading short passages to keep panic from rising in crowded darkness. Silas shoveled, hauled, and obeyed instructions from the woman he had tried to push off her own ground. And he did it without bargaining language because bargaining had no value at -38. When the storm finally broke late on January 14th, Dry Creek stepped into a landscape altered beyond recognition. Drifts as high as porch roofs on north faces, livestock losses scattered across open lots, and streets reduced to narrow trenches cut by hand. One named death marked the cost in human terms that no speech could soften. Ned Creed, found after leaving the shelter line in whiteout. Funerals on the frontier often compressed grief into duty because chores did not pause for mourning, yet this burial slowed the town to silence. Silas stood at the grave with hat in both hands and said no words over the coffin, while wind moved through cemetery grass, flattened under snow crust, and every family measured what chance had separated their own names from his son's. The rescue period continued for days after skies cleared. Houses had to be reopened, pipes thawed, and weak stoves reset. Russell sent teams out with measured supplies, small sacks of flour, strips of pork, kindling bundles, and shared kerosene tins for homes where lamps had gone dark. She released stores in controlled amounts to avoid second-week shortages and asked each receiving household to return only one thing when able: labor for rebuilding line routes before next winter. Annie Pike carried notes between house clusters and Russell's claim, becoming the smallest courier in a town that had spent months treating the widow as socially peripheral. Each successful delivery answered a practical obstacle, and each obstacle resolved exposed the deeper one still waiting, the legal hearing in March where occupancy intent would decide title. Deputy Bell faced his own reckoning before that hearing. He had refused Russell's complaints in autumn as civil noise unworthy of law action. During the storm, he watched her shelter operate as the only stable emergency center within riding distance, and he watched triage, rationing, and line control hold through 4 days while homes without those preparations failed. That observation resolved his previous hesitation about formal involvement. He could now state exactly what he had been unable to state before, that harassment over access routes had impaired pre-storm preparation, and that Russell had continued continuous residence and substantial improvements despite coercive pressure. He drafted a sworn affidavit with date references from his own notebook, including his autumn refusals and his January rescue observations, then filed it with county authorities as supporting testimony for her final proof record. March 1888 brought the final proof hearing in a room less crowded than the September humiliation scene, and far more sober in tone. Russell presented Elias's ledgers, oilcloth preserved, pages intact, showing 5 years of occupancy work from 1882 forward, crop entries, repairs, material receipts, and measurements that matched improvements visible on site. She placed open pages for October and November 1887, where her initials marked daily labor after Elias's death, the wall courses brought to 24 inches, the root cellar taken to 9 feet, and the 14 cords hauled by the longer Creek Bend route on dates when the North Draw remained blocked. Reverend Mercer testified to continuous residence after Elias's death in April 1887. Deputy Bell testified to harassment reports, his own prior refusal, and what he witnessed in rescue triage when her preparations became the town's only functioning shelter system. Annie Pike's storm arrival log, entered by Bell during the blizzard, was read into the record as the first outside aid request received at Russell's door. Silas Creed took the stand last. He did not perform defiance. He stated under oath that Russell had remained on claim, improved structures, and maintained lawful possession through the full period required for proof. The challenge to occupancy intent ended in that room. Legal process moved slower than weather, yet momentum had shifted. With local proof accepted in March, patent issuance entered federal channels, and Russell returned to the same work that had carried her through every prior dispute: planting, repairs, and seasonal stock planning. Silas ceased interference on wagon access and publicly yielded right-of-way across the contested North Draw route, recorded in trustee notes, so no successor could quietly reverse it. He stated for the minutes that he yielded it as debt owed from the storm night when Russell admitted him and his men without condition after he had blocked her hauls in autumn. Martha Pike reopened credit on ordinary terms and proposed a winter stores cooperative stocked before freeze each year, jointly managed by households rather than one merchant ledger. The proposal gained support because memory remained close, and memory in frontier towns often held stronger than statute when cold had recently tested every claim made by pride. Reverend Mercer organized the reckoning at church in late spring, not as ceremony of praise and not as quick apology to erase harm, but as public accounting of what had happened and what each institution in town had failed to do before crisis forced correction. He read from September storehouse notes in full lines, Silas saying a widow on 160 acres had no honest intention of perfecting title, Ned saying she dug a cellar to hide from her own shadows, and Martha closing the ledger to announce cash for cash, while Bell declined her complaint about the block draw as civil disagreement. He then read Bell's filed affidavit, including the triage entries written under lamplight in Russell's shelter. He asked Silas to speak first among those who had held authority. Silas stood in the same building where Russell's warning had been dismissed, and said his confidence in his own judgment had outweighed evidence he should have respected, that he had blocked the wagon track and then entered by her leave when his own houses failed, and that his son had died after leaving a shelter line because the town had treated preparation as ridicule rather than duty. Martha Pike spoke next, naming her own choices plainly. She had used cash-only policy when Russell needed supply flexibility most, and she had allowed social pressure to shape credit decisions while telling herself she was only protecting inventory risk. Deputy Bell admitted he had hidden behind civil procedure language when repeated obstruction should have triggered documentation at minimum, intervention if possible, and he confirmed he had already filed that admission under oath with county authorities. Annie stood with her mother near the front pew as Mercer read the storm log line that placed her bell strike at Russell's gate first, among all arrivals, and that first arrival was entered in church record as the turn where refusal ended and open-door shelter began. None of those statements asked Russell for immediate absolution. They named facts, causes, and costs. When Russell rose, she did not offer easy forgiveness phrased as if winter had left no scar. She said survival had required everyone present, and future safety would require training any household willing to learn wall insulation, fuel staging, rope line placement, and ration math before weather made learning expensive. That response set the terms of Dry Creek's next 3 years. Weekly sessions began in June and continued each autumn, with Russell teaching practical winter standards from her claim yard and church annex. She demonstrated sod block cutting angles, seam packing methods, stove ventilation checks, root cellar drainage, and ration planning by head count and workload. She taught children to tie waist ropes with mittens on. She taught men who had once mocked her to measure door sweep gaps with candle smoke and repair drafts before first freeze. Martha's cooperative stocked shared reserves under transparent tallies. Bell established storm incident logs as routine law practice. Mercer kept written copies of every standard agreed by the town, preserving memory in ink before memory could fade into pride again. In 1891, the land patent for Russell Harmon's 160-acre claim arrived with federal seal and proper chain of approval, completing a process that had nearly failed under social pressure, long before it failed under law. She accepted the document at the trustee desk with no speech prepared. Silas stood present and removed his hat as she signed receipt. The patent resolved title, yet title alone did not explain the legacy Dry Creek carried from that winter. The town adopted communal winter standards formally, including minimum household stores, mandatory rope lines for key paths before December, shared emergency shelter assignments, and cooperative fuel stacks inspected each November. Those standards came from practical lessons written in one dead son's grave marker, one child's knock at a storm porch that opened rescue for everyone behind her, and one widow's refusal to make survival a transaction. Years later, travelers who stopped at Dry Creek heard a version of the story from many mouths, each one emphasizing a different failure and a different rescue detail. Though the core record remained stable because Reverend Mercer had preserved transcripts and Bell had preserved affidavits, and because Elias Harmon's ledgers still sat on Russell's shelf, pages browned at the edges and exact in their dates. Visitors saw rope lines pre-hung by first frost, wood measured in stacks that households reported honestly, and schoolchildren reciting storm routes to designated shelters, beginning with the account of Annie Pike reaching the Bell Line first in the January whiteout. Russell remained on her claim, title confirmed, teaching each season with the same measured cadence she had used when no one listened, then when everyone had to. The frontier had delivered its own verdict without caring who held rank in town, and the verdict endured because she chose generosity at the moment. Resentment would have been easiest.